Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Peppis, filling in for Barbara Altman. Our guest today is David Cortright, Director of Policy Studies at the Kroc Institute of International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Cortright has a long history of public advocacy for disarmament and the prevention of war. As an active duty soldier during the Vietnam War, he spoke against the conflict. In 1978, Cortright was named the Executive Director of SANE, the Committee for Sane Nuclear Policy, which became the largest disarmament organization in the U.S. He was active in the nuclear freeze movement of the 1980s. Cortright has written widely on nonviolent social change, nuclear disarmament, and the use of multilateral sanctions and incentives as tools of international diplomacy. His latest book, Ending Obama's War: Responsible Military Withdrawal from Afghanistan, was published in 2011. Cortright gave a lecture entitled Afghan Women Speak, Enhancing Security and Human Rights in Afghanistan on May 4th, 2012. His lecture was sponsored by Women's Action for New Directions, WAND, Women's and Gender Studies, and the Oregon Humanities Center. It was part of the year-long conflict series. David, thanks for talking to us today.
Thank you.
How did your service during the Vietnam War affect your political views and your personal views?
Well, it was really formative in my whole thinking. I often tell my students that my trajectory towards peace studies is quite unusual. I got my start by being drafted into the Army. In 1968, I was not political at all, but as soon as I learned about what was going on in Vietnam, talked to the vets who were coming back, I had a crisis of conscience. I couldn't continue with the war experience, and I began to speak out against the war as an active duty soldier, and that really set me on a path of working for peace to prevent war that I've been on all the rest of my life.
What challenges did you face as a soldier speaking out against the war?
Well, it's always difficult. You know, you anticipate and you know that you're going to face repression from the command, and that's part of the decision-making process. You know, I had to realize that doing this was going to affect the rest of my life. But going forward with business as usual would as well. And it's not a choice I wanted to make, but I had to choose the path that seemed to me to be the right one. For me, it was relatively modest. You know, we had some punishments. I got punitively transferred out. But then I actually filed a lawsuit against the Army, and that became a sort of a vehicle for speaking out against the war during the lawsuit. So, you know, it's always a challenge that you are going to face repression, but that's part of the decision you make in speaking out.
What was the outcome of the lawsuit?
Well, we were actually successful at the federal district court level in New York. I was stationed at Fort Hamilton, so we went into the federal courts there, and our contention was that their actions to repress us, to punish us, and to transfer us were not because of military necessity, but because they were trying to suppress our First Amendment right to speak out. And by a miracle, the court in the Eastern District accepted our argument. So we won, but then it was appealed to the Second Circuit, which overturned, and the Supreme Court denied review.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about the iconic Antiwar poster you posed for in 1969.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I was committed to working against the war as a soldier, and one day I got a call from the Student Mobilization Committee, one of the anti-war groups based in New York, asking if I would pose for an anti-war poster. I said, anything I can do to end the war. So came down to Manhattan and went to the studio, knocked on the door, and there was a fellow named Richard Avedon. I didn't know who he was. Just went into the studio and put my uniform on, and he had a dove, and he put it on my forearm, and he said, okay, I want you to pose, and then he said, now move your arm just a little bit. And the dove flapped its wings, and he caught it beautifully. And it's a beautiful image, and it's published in some of his books, and so it's a great honor to have been part of that experience.
Why did you continue to advocate for justice and peace after the Vietnam War?
Well, I felt that the commitment to work against war had given me a sense of purpose. Frankly, you know, as a 21-year-old kid, graduated from college, I didn't know what I was going to do in life. I didn't want to go to war. And when I got drafted, I had to, but then I started to speak out, and that gave me a sense of fulfillment. And this whole experience of resisting and speaking out, I felt that we were making a difference, that, you know, the war dragged on horribly, and so many people were killed needlessly, but we were speaking out against it, and that felt like the right thing to do. And I felt that I needed to continue that, partly because I realized in that experience that Vietnam was just not just a war. It wasn't just a mistake. This was part of the American system. We had become a militarized state, and war making was part of the fiber of our whole political system. And realizing that was shocking and horrifying, but it also gave me a sense that, I should really work to deal with this issue, to try to prevent future wars and to somehow demilitarize American policy. And it's a long and difficult challenge. We haven't really succeeded yet, but I feel it's an important purpose for my life, and I'm happy that I'm able to contribute in that area.
What led to your involvement with the nuclear disarmament movement?
Well, actually, I was called to ask if I would be a candidate for the directorship of SANE, the Committee for Sane Nuclear Policy, the very venerable nuclear disarmament group. This was a few years after I got out of the Army, after I was part of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War after the war. And so I said, well, sure, I knew about SANE and didn't know a whole lot about nuclear weapons at the time, but I knew SANE had been an organization that was one of the first to speak out against the Vietnam War. So I went and they hired me, and so I was, just fortunate to be asked to serve in a particular time. And that was right when the nuclear freeze movement is emerging. And SANE, when I came into the organization, was at a very low state, very few members, but the concern about nuclear weapons was reemerging in society, stronger than ever, which was the nuclear freeze movement. And I was sort of at the ground floor when that was all taking off. And so the organization grew tremendously, and the freeze movement became a massive populist campaign across the whole country.
Could you say a little bit more about how the freeze movement affected U.S. policy?
Well, I think it was significant. I mean, it was dismissed politically by the Reagan administration and then later by Bush the first. But in fact, if you look at the record, the freeze movement, because it was so widespread and there were so many people in every part of the country who were involved in it, there were 8 states where there were referenda, popular referenda. Should the United States and Soviet Union freeze the arms race? In 7 out of those 8 states, voters were approving. Many big cities, LA, I think Seattle, Chicago, Philadelphia, had city referenda. It was a widely supported proposition. And so even the Reagan administration, which was very hawkish and anti-Soviet and anti-communist, began to shift its political rhetoric and entered into negotiations with the Soviets in the first year in office. And when they campaigned, the Reaganites said, well, we're not going to negotiate until we have peace through strength, and so we have a big nuclear buildup. But within 6 to 8 months after they came into office, they were negotiating. And they consciously said at the time this was a way to address the popular concern. And many other ways in which their issues, their positions were moderated because of the broad popular demand for an end to the arms race. We stalemated the MX missile system. Nuclear testing was stopped in the 1980s entirely through citizen action, which mobilized for several years, finally got a vote in the House of Representatives to cut off the funding for nuclear testing. That came from the freeze movement, not by the administration. And then finally in the Senate as well. And Bush the first was, against his better wishes, was forced to sign the legislation to end nuclear testing. So there were that, and there were many other ways in which the freeze movement did have an impact in the overall political climate, shifting the terms of debate and having some specific policy suggestions that were actually adopted.
Tell us about the Kroc Institute and your role there.
Well, the Kroc Institute is a wonderful place. It's just quite amazing. At the University of Notre Dame, quite conservative Catholic university. It was created by Father Ted Hesburgh, and he felt in the 1980s that a great university should study peace. We study physics and all of these other great things, but peace is of critical importance to human knowledge, to human future. And so he began to set up this organization. And fortunately, he was out in La Jolla speaking at an event one day, and there was this lady, Joan Kroc, in the audience, who was deeply touched by his message and came up to him and said, Father Ted, what can I do to help? And he had the right answer, of course, and she began to support the program, and so we're blessed to have a great endowment. But it's been used very wisely because we have a big undergraduate education program, several hundred undergrads who are taking peace studies as a minor, and some can even major in it. We have a master's degree program where there are 35 international students who come on a full scholarship to study on peace and conflict, and we have now a PhD program. And we look at the very practical dimensions of peace building. We have the policy track, which is what I manage, which is how do we take these ideas and put them into the policy discourse and try to bring about concrete changes. We have another whole track which deals with conflict resolution and conflict transformation, and how do you get into these conflict settings and try to get the parties to talk together and resolve their differences through dialogue rather than through violence and killing. And then we have another track which is on basically managing organizations, non-governmental nonprofit organizations in the humanitarian field, the development field, and the peacebuilding field, because this is a huge challenge that many young people are idealistic. They want to change the world, but it's also a kind of a business, and you have to manage organizations, raise money, manage people. So that's another part of our curriculum. So we try to make it very practical, that peace is not a fuzzy idea. It's a concrete reality. It's a difficult challenge, and we have to know specifically how to do it, and that's what we're about. So.
What is strategic peace building?
Well, strategic is in a couple senses. One is that in any strategy you have an objective, and you focus your efforts to achieve that objective. So in any conflict setting, there has to be a strategic analysis to understand how do we bring this conflict to an end, come to that understanding, and then begin to mobilize all the different elements that are part of the tool of peace building, the tools of peace building, from negotiations to the actual peacekeeping forces, to the role of religious communities, the role of civil society in those communities. Sometimes, yes, there is a security role, a role for the military. All of that needs to be put together in a coherent plan to achieve the specific objective. So it's a way of thinking about peace and peace building in a much more comprehensive, holistic dimension, focused on achieving the concrete objectives.
How effective are sanctions as an alternative to military intervention?
Well, sanctions are a tool that are being used much more widely now than during the days of the Cold War. There are now 10 or 11 UN sanctions episodes, and the U.S. and the European Union put sanctions on a lot of countries. And they are a way of exerting pressure to address violations of international norms and international law. For example, in non-proliferation, North Korea stepped out of the non-proliferation treaty, tested weapons, so therefore the international community puts on these sanctions to send a signal that this is behavior that's contrary to international norms, and to try to constrain their ability to develop more nuclear weapons. So they can be effective. And sanctions have multiple purposes. They're not very effective at coercing, at forcing a government to do something, because we know in politics governments do what they decide, and they have to be beholden to their own domestic constituencies. And for that kind of coercion purpose, maybe 1/3 of the time, they have some effect. But in other dimensions, they are more successful. They can constrain behavior. That is to say, they can cut off the flow of arms, or in the case of proliferation, the sensitive nuclear technologies and materials, or cut off the flow of financing, either through like diamond embargoes or timber embargoes, or through directly freezing the financial assets. So they have some effects, and they also are a signaling device. They communicate the international community's norms in terms of principles of non-proliferation, or trying to end armed conflicts, or to uphold human rights. And so in that sense, they also have a purpose.
There are some limitations and problems with them, in your view?
Many problems with sanctions. One is that they so often are seen as connected to military force. It's sort of like ticket punching. You go through, check off this, and then you can use force. And we sort of saw this in Libya, where the idea initially was to have sanctions to try to constrain the Gaddafi regime in terms of its suppression of the uprising. But then very quickly they led to the authorization for a, quote, no-fly zone, which ended up being actually a military intervention and a change of government, regime change operation. So they are too easily used as part of a coercive form of diplomacy that can lead to war. That's one of the big problems. Another is that it's very hard to get all governments to work together. And there's always going to be some cheating that goes on. In the case of North Korea, for example, it's well known that China is a conduit for a lot of illegal shipments of nuclear materials. Or in Sudan, again, the Chinese, their equipment, their planes have been identified as providing arms to some of the rebels who are killing innocent people. So you have those problems. And the other, in terms of the UN, is, and actually with the U.S., is that the sanctions become a tool of the major powers to often try to dominate and coerce and exert their hegemony over other states. And we see this very often with the sanctions through the UN and with the UN and with the U.S. and the European Union working together. I think the sanctions in Iran have sort of become of that character. I mean, there was a legitimate case for saying that Iran should conform with the UN resolutions and come clean and be more transparent about its nuclear activities. But they've become now a tool of coercion by the Europeans and the U.S. to try to force the Iranian government to cave into international demands. And in that sense, I think then their purpose gets distorted by great power politics.
Would you say a little bit more about your view of the current situation in Iran?
Well, I think with Iran, as I say, there's a legitimate concern to get Iran to comply with international norms, to constrain its nuclear program. But Iran does have a legal right to enrich uranium, as there are many other states that do this and are not subject to sanctions. And it would be very possible to come to an agreement on this standoff right now, and it would be based on the principle that, yes, let's recognize Iran's right to enrich, and in return, Iran will agree to more rigorous transparency and international inspections, and to then go from there towards a much more cooperative arrangement. We seem to want to have a confrontation with Iran, and we've turned down a number of significant offers. It's not well known, but in 2003, the Iranian government sent a message to the U.S. saying, we're willing to constrain our enrichment. We're willing to cooperate in a whole number of other international areas, but we'd like you to ease off on the sanctions and begin to recognize us as an equal member of the community of nations. And that was turned down by the Bush administration. And even now, where there are options for trying to resolve this crisis, whenever they come up, we seem to reject them.
Do you think that there are political benefits for the Iranian government in not following the approach that you're advocating for?
Yeah, very definitely. And there are political benefits on both sides. In the Iranian side, the Ayatollahs who run the place and the conservative government forces, they don't want to ease up on this confrontation because it's easy. It's a way for them to mobilize their own community behind the adversary. They can blame all the problems in the society on the foreigners and the U.S. devil. If they had to deal with their own community and their own issues, I think their leash on political life would be much shorter, and they know it. From the U.S. side, it allows our political leaders to be tough, and to cultivate the right-wing Israeli political policies, Netanyahu, and that brings political benefits in the U.S. So you have, on both sides, you can see there's political interests and gains that come from perpetrating this confrontational approach.
How can terrorism be countered without military intervention? What are the most effective strategies in your view?
Well, I would argue that terrorism can only be countered by non-military means, that the most effective means are political. Terrorism is fundamentally a political phenomenon. Everyone knows that. It's UN commissions, the 9/11 Commission, everyone admits that. And so it has to be addressed through political means. And there are a number of studies that have been produced. The RAND Corporation did a study in 2008 called How Terrorist Groups End, and they found two principal ways in which terrorist groups come to an end. One is law enforcement, good old-fashioned law enforcement, finding who these extremists are, tracking them down, arresting them, bringing them to justice. And the other is through a political process. By beginning to negotiate, reach out to these groups. We always say we don't negotiate with terrorists, but we always, almost in the end, do talk to them because we have to. And in the process, try to reach a political accommodation where the militant group realizes it can get more through a political process, giving up the bombing and the guns for the ballot and the political contention than they would through these other means. So in many cases, the political approach has worked. The example I always give is the IRA. We used to be a terrible terrorist organization, killed so many hundreds of people in the UK and in Ireland itself. And they had their long war, and eventually they decided that a political process makes sense. And the US and the Brits and others pushed this process forward, and we have the Good Friday Accords. And now those who were terrorists are now becoming statesmen in Ireland and Northern Ireland. And this is the way terrorism comes to an end. And it can be followed, this path can be followed in many other settings. So,
the war in Afghanistan is the longest in U.S. history, yet you're concerned about the drawdown of military forces. What's the basis of your concern?
Well, I think we need to end the war, absolutely, and that this whole idea that we needed to wage a war in Afghanistan to counter al-Qaeda was misguided from the beginning, in my opinion. But we've gone through it, and now we are starting gradually to pull down the forces, which we should. But it'd be, I think, a big mistake for us to simply abandon Afghanistan and walk away, as was done in the 1990s after the war of the Mujahideen against the Soviets. You know, we all saw Charlie Wilson's War, the film, and you know, it's correct at the end when they point out how it was a big mistake to abandon Afghanistan. And so, as we pull out, we need to recognize that that's just one part of the solution. The other part is the need for a comprehensive political solution. Another part is the commitment to continued social development support for the people of Afghanistan. Now, the political part is going to be the most difficult, but ultimately we need to put the parties together, the Afghan government, the Pakistani military, which is funding the insurgents, and then the insurgents themselves, and probably India and some of the neighboring states as well, and work out a comprehensive deal. Now, all the sides right now are fighting each other, and they all have these, you know, unnegotiable demands. But they do need to be brought together, and the U.S. has the power and the influence and the leverage right now to make this happen. And while we're still there, I think it's urgent that we bring the parties together for a comprehensive political negotiation. It'll probably take weeks and months to hammer it all out, but it needs to be done. And at the end of the day, hopefully you would have an Afghan government that's more representative of all the people, including the Pashtuns who've been excluded, and a way in which the insurgents would feel that at least some of their demands are being satisfied. And then combine that with continued support for the social development programs that have been working to improve the status of Afghan women, the whole society, through better education access, better healthcare availability. These things have actually worked and should be continued as we move to a demilitarization strategy.
You co-authored a report with your colleague Sarah Smiles-Persinger called Afghan Women Speak. What did you learn?
Well, we were there. We talked to lots of women, to government officials all around the country, and we learned several things. One is that the women of Afghanistan recognize that they cannot secure their rights in a militarized environment, that the longer the war goes on, the more they are threatened, not just by the Taliban, but by the people in their own government, in the Kabul government that we are funding, who include a lot of the warlords and mujahideen from the 1980s. So the war needs to end. But we also learned that there's grave concern about the danger that the Taliban might come back. And the women, most of all, fear this and don't want to see those dark days return. So that's why we need, as we withdraw militarily, a strategy politically to try to get the parties to work together so that the insurgency can come to an end. And why this social funding also needs to be continued. One of the things we heard while we were there is we need protection. You know, the women would say, when we go out on the streets, we're not being protected. Even though there's all these U.S. and international troops there, there's 300,000 troops in the Afghan National Army and National Police, and yet nobody's protecting us. And as the U.S. pulls out, they fear that they will be subjected to more violence. So one of the ideas that came up was, what about an interim peacekeeping force? What the Taliban themselves have proposed, that there be a, quote, Muslim-led international peacekeeping force. And they've said that they would work with such a force and not attack it, so that there could be protection for civilians and to facilitate the transition from war to a more stable, peaceful future for Afghanistan. So that's an idea that we think really needs to be considered. Get countries like Indonesia or Turkey to help lead a force that would be under UN authority, not under US NATO authority, and with a substantial Muslim presence to try to facilitate a peacemaking process.
Do you foresee the U.S. ever having a Department of Peace?
Well, one would hope. I know there's legislation for a U.S. Department of Peace. We have a U.S. Institute of Peace, a small organization which actually just got its budget cut by Congress. That does decent work, but really we need something much bigger. And ideally, that's what our U.S. Department of State should be. And I must say that under Secretary Clinton, it has moved a bit more in that direction. There are now peace-building divisions within the Department of State that weren't there before. We now have a quadrennial report on development and defense. Used to be just a quadrennial report on defense. Now we link development to our defense and the security of the world, which is a very smart and appropriate understanding. So we need to have a department that focuses on peacemaking. Just as we found at our university as we study peace and at many other places around the world where peace is being examined, it's a science, it's a discipline. It requires focused attention. It just doesn't happen naturally. You have to really build peace and work on it on these multiple fashions in this strategic context in order to prevent war and help communities live more peacefully in cooperation.
On that peaceful note, I'd like to thank you for speaking with us today.
Okay, thank you.
We've been speaking with David Cortright, Director of Policy Studies at the Kroc Institute of International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. He gave a talk at UO titled Afghan Women Speak, Enhancing Security and Human Rights in Afghanistan on May 4th, 2012. Thank you very much for watching.